So, first of all I would like to introduce myself. I am Professor Ashish Saxena, working as a professor in Department of Sociology, University of Allahabad. And as we know that today we are here for discussing upon the women's studies, and within that we have unit 15 in that sense, which is basically dealing with the stories that the state tells. And within this I am going to speak about what are the India's initiatives in that sense, basically with regard to the women and the girl child. And in this the basic understanding is that how the Indian governments, whatever they are planning, how they are going to be taken up by the people and the masses, and what are their implications on the society. Now, let us say when we try to speak about this module, the very first thing in that sense of course is that we should have some prior knowledge about that what are the things which are required for the student or the learner to know about this module. The first thing in that sense is that he or she should have a clear understanding about the basic fundamental rights which are part and parcel of our Indian Constitution. It also deals with the various directive principles which are associated with the Indian constitutions, and within this the basic objective of this module is to have a trajectory of the government initiatives which are meant for the empowerment of women and the girl child. Now, as we find that to deal with these issues, I think we require certain specific keywords which are basically necessary for understanding the phenomenon, and for that I think certain battery of terms required to be understood, which includes the issue of development, the constitutional provisions, the program for women upliftment, and the concept of women empowerment. I think these terms in that sense are quite big in itself, but I think to have a blanket understanding of these terms are necessary. Like, to begin with, I will start up with the issue of development. Now, what we think about or what thing comes in our mind when we try to speak about the development. I think the very first thing that is essential for the understanding of development in the modern context is that we have to see the society in terms of advancement, which is associated with the advent of science, technology, the issues of democracy, and also the various values, the modern values which are associated with the development of the society. And the basic essence of this development is to have the betterment of the society, which we try to see in terms of that it should be beneficial for the majority. That of course is the whole essence of the issue of development. Now, apart from that, another important thing which is associated with development, which has been talked about by Amartya Sen, is talking about the quality of life. I think that is the basic crux for any development program, that it should enhance the quality of life of the individual and the group. And if the development is meant for the society in general, definitely it is going to have a wider implications on the total society. Now, when we see or when we talk about the development, I think it tries to cover up many things, but the most important thing in that sense of course is that its concern should be restricted to certain specific sections. It may include your gender, it may include your weaker sections, it may include your marginalized groups, and many other things. Like here of course, the topic of our concern is the issue of gender. Now, as we know that gender is basically what? Gender is basically a notion which is socially constructed. How we are going to make a distinction between a male and a female? It is basically based on that how the society perceives a male or a female, like in terms of the understanding of the fair sex, or we try to see it as something which is aggressive will be male, or something which is submissive is female. So, somewhere we have to see that the understanding of what gender should be, it basically comes from the society. But otherwise, we try to see that we have been brought together in terms of equality by God. Like we have male and female, the distinction is biologically there, but how the society is going to make labeling for that, and that is how we try to understand the gender. Now, when we try to speak about the issue of gender in terms of equality, I think the society alone is not responsible for bringing about the issue of gender equality, and that is why there is a need for the Indian Constitution, which basically deals with to provide certain positive discriminations in the favor of women. And I think if you try to see in the democratic platform, we try to find out that there are various plans which are basically meant for the upliftment of the women's, and especially we try to find out that the equality for women, a project which has been launched at the international level, that came into the picture in 1975. And in the Indian context, if you try to see, in the 5th 5-year plan, we have a documentation where the women in terms of the development was taken into concern. And from there onwards, we try to speak about the understanding of women from welfareist to the development. And then only we try to speak about the next notion, that is the issue of empowerment. And basically we try to see that 1990s onward, we have a specific programs which were basically meant for the women empowerment rather than speaking about the welfareist scheme for the women's. Now, we have certain other issues. Basically, when we try to see that what are the different issues that took place, like as I discussed earlier, that there was a status of women's in India report which was called as the Towards Equality, that came in 1974. Now, this is basically seen in terms of a documentation plan which has been called as the National Perspective Plan for the Women in 1988 till 2000. Now, another important thing is that these issues which have been taken up in the various 5-year plans, they could not bring about a drastic change, because the development which took place in the Indian society was not simply restricted to the women. So, we have to have the direct and indirect interventions which have to deal with the issue of gender. Like when we try to speak about the gender disparity. Now, gender disparity is something which can be manifested at different period of time in the different space in a different format. Like the issue of gender in terms of discrimination can be reflected, that how the different culture has their own role to project the issue of discrimination. And in that way, we basically, when we try to speak about the empowerment of women, I think the more better interpretation of this fact is that we are not talking about that one is superior and the other is inferior. Rather, we try to see that there is a mutual relationship which exists between both the two genders, and it is not only simply giving a power to one, rather the important thing in that sense of course is that it's overpower one, rather than we try to see it in terms of giving power to both of them. So, the basic understanding in that sense of course is that the gender, how it has to be balanced, it has to be seen in terms of having a duality of power, where both of them are equally important for the development of the society. Now, if we try to see what are the various provisions which are meant for the women's in India, and especially we try to see in terms of the constitutional provisions. Now, the very first thing in that sense is that the Constitution of India guarantees certain rights to the citizens in general, definitely includes women. But within that, we have the right to equality, which has been enshrined in Article 14 and 16. Now, other than that, we also have to treat women equally in terms of the right to means of livelihood, and that covers under Article 39A. We have also right to life, which is part and parcel of Article 21. And also we have the right to equality, which is basically for the equal protection before the law, and that came into existence in through the Article 15. And we also have the provision for the discrimination in favor of women, and that is basically reflected through the Article 15(3). Now, the basic idea in that sense of course is that these provisions, the constitutional provisions which are made, they are basically meant for bringing about the dignified life of the women in general, and which is being spoken by the Article 51A E of the Indian Constitution. Now, let us try to speak about certain other issues, that what are the legal protections which are meant for the women. So, we had the constitutional provisions and we have the legal provisions. Now, the legal protections for the women can be seen through certain enactments, like we have the law related to the dowry, to the marriage and to the divorce. We have the Dowry Prohibition Act 1961, which came long before. We have the Foreign Marriage Act, which came in 1969. We have the Special Marriage Act, which came in 1954. We have the Christian Marriage Act, which came in 1872. We have the Hindu Marriage Act, which came in 1955. Similarly, we have many such provisions, especially we have the provision on the Child Marriage Act, which took place in 2006. So, we try to find out that legally also there are many provisions which are meant for the women in general. Now, try to come to the another aspect of life of the women, that is speaking about the working women. Now, the working women basically has certain privileges. Definitely they have to move from the private sphere to the public sphere. Now, within public sphere they have to be safeguarded with certain what you can say law, the measures in that sense which can help them in the working situation. Like we try to find out that women are not in the harsh job, rather they are engaged in certain informal sectors, they are also engaged in the lighter work, and in that way there are certain provisions which are meant for women, basically the working women. Like long back we have the Bidi and the Cigar Workers Conditions of Employment Act that was implemented in 1966. We have the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act in 1976. We have the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act of 1970. We have the Employee State Insurance Act of 1948, and parallelly we have the Equal Remuneration Act which came in 1976. And apart from that, we have certain provisions in the Factory Act of 1948. We have the maternity benefit which was been included in 1961. We have the minimum wages that was in 1948. We also have a provisions for the Plantation and the Mining Act which were been implemented in due course of time. Now, these are the provisions which are basically meant for the working women. Now, we also had certain laws which are related to the women in terms of their livelihood, in terms of their dignity, in terms of their family affairs. Like we try to speak about the Indian Succession Act of 1925, which is basically related to the inheritance of the property. We have the Married Women Property Act of 1874. We have the Hindu Succession Act later on in 1956. We have the Muslim Personal Law Shariat Application Act of 1937, which of course was been seriously taken up in the later phase. Now, we also have other than the property rights, we have certain rights which are basically meant for protecting the women against the crimes. Like when we try to speak about the crime related issues, we have seeing that the women are the victims in the domestic affairs, and for that we have the protection of the women from the Domestic Violence Act that came in 2005. Then also we have the Commission of Sati which was been banned long back in 1987. We also have the Dowry Prohibition Act which was implemented in 1961, and we also have the Immoral Trafficking Act in 1956. Now, these are certain provisions which are basically given to the women to fight against the criminal issues. Now, these are the legal measures, the constitutional measures. Now, apart from that, the government is also planning to have certain other measures, and for that they have basically framed a proper body which is called as the Ministry of Women and the Child Development. Now, this ministry came into existence in 1985, and the basic motto of the ministry was to have a holistic development of the women and the children. Now, this ministry has the various components, and especially if you try to see, we can divide them into 6 autonomous organizations which are part and parcel of this ministry. The first one is the National Institute of Public Cooperation and the Child Development, called as the NIPSED. We have the National Commission for Women. We also have the National Commission for the Protection of the Child Rights. We also have the Central Resource Agency. We also have the Central Social Welfare Board. We also have the Rashtriya Mahila Kosh. Now, these are the autonomous organizations which are working for the upliftment of the women, and which comes under the purview of the Ministry of Women and the Child Development. Now, when we try to speak about certain other measures, we try to find out that these schemes or the provisions which are there or the legal measures which are there, they are basically meant for the development of the women in general. Now, if we try to see that what are the acts which were being implemented through the Ministry of the Women and the Child Development, like we try to speak about the Immoral Traffic in the Women and the Girl Act, that was in 1956. We have the Indecent Representation of the Women Prevention Act of 1986, the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961. We have the Commission of Sati Prevention Act that came into existence in 1987, and similarly we have certain other measures which are basically meant for the coordination, planning, evaluation, monitoring, project formulations and the other welfare schemes meant for the women. Now, these are the issues which basically we try to see that they focus upon the women either directly or indirectly, and they have to do directly or indirectly with the various affairs of the women. Like we try to speak about the women in the family, we try to see the women in the public sphere, we try to see the women with relation to the property, the economic sphere, we try to see the women in terms of the political empowerment. So, these are certain measures which are being meant by or which has been managed by the Ministry of Women and the Child Development for overall development of the women. Now, if we try to see all these issues which are being covered up like the planning, coordination, monitoring or the gender sensitive database. Now, these are the things which are basically helping the organizations to have some previous feedback, and on the basis of that we can go ahead with the future plans. Now, apart from these things, we have the specific provisions for the women, like we try to see in a holistic way. Now, let us try to have a specific programs which are meant for the specific section. Like the first one which we try to see is the relationship between the education and the women. Now, we have certain provisions in the programs which are meant for the upliftment of the women in relation to the education, like we have the early childhood education. Now, this is basically the part of the integrated child development services programs which has came in the 8th 5-year plan, and it has a huge success. Basically, it was meant for the non-formal education for the girl child in that sense, as such, providing assistance to the girls in that sense in terms of teaching and learning in that sense as such. Now, apart from that, we also has certain provisions which has been incorporated in 1986, which is called as the NP scheme. Now, this is also meant for bringing about certain intervention to the development of the women in terms of the education. And here of course, education definitely is seen as the agency for the empowerment of the women, and it also helps in making the women more efficient by having the redesigning of the course curriculum in terms of specific textbooks which are meant for the proper understanding of the women's reality, and also the orientation of the teachers to have certain amount of what you can say training for the women, and it also deals with that how they can cope up with the issue of decision makings and also their involvement in the various educational institutions. So, there are certain provisions through these policies. Now, as we discussed that the national policy of empowerment which came into existence in 2001, and it was basically an outcome of the previous NP scheme of 1986. Now, what are the various policies which are been prescribed? The basic fundamental thing is that there should be equal access to education for the women and the girls. I think that is the very essential thing. Then we also try to see that there should be certain special measures will be taken to eliminate the discrimination at least in the formal space which are meant against the women. Then another important aspect of the NP is that to have the universalization of education for all, we also have to eradicate illiteracy, which will directly or indirectly affect the development. We also have to have certain gender sensitive educational system, so that the society should be aware about the gender equality. We also have to have the increase in enrollment of the girl child, and also not only the enrollment, but the retention of the girl child in the school. And beyond that, the more important issue in that sense which is involved with regard to the education is the quality of education. Simply education provision is not sufficient. So, definitely you need to have the quality of education which is required for the development of the women, and all these things were basically meant for having the issue whereby there is the reduction of the gender gap between the male and the female, and especially in the higher education. And now also we have that Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, which of course is another important initiative, and it basically deals with that there should not be selective elimination of the girls in the name of sex in that sense as such, and the women and the girl child should have the equal participation for having the achievement of the education. Now, these programs which we have spoken, either it is the national policy for the empowerment of the women, the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao Andolan, and many such issues, they are basically meant for the understanding of women and how through education they are going to be empowered. Like when we try to speak about certain other measures that are basically dealing with that how these higher education, elementary education, the so called primary education, how they are going to be beneficial for the society. Now, these issues which we are talking about, the basic educational curriculum, the basic pedagogy which is associated with the women, all these things are required to be demonstrated and effectively implemented, so that women's empowerment can really take place. Now, this was related to the women and education. Coming down to another issue which is equally important, that is the women and the health. Basically, in terms of health, we also have the issue of the nutrition, the quality nutrition. Now, what are the various provisions which are meant for the women in relation to the health? The first one normally which we try to see, which we have discussed earlier also, the integrated child development service, which was also part of the education, but here also this is required, because the important thing is that the health and the nutrition is an important component of ICDS scheme, which is part of the Government of India program. Then we also have the Rajiv Gandhi scheme for empowerment of adolescent girls, which is called as the Sabla. Now, this is basically for the adolescent girls which are in the age of 11 to 18 years, and the basic idea in that sense of course is to provide the nutritional and the health status, upgrading their home skills, the life skills and the vocational skills. And also we have the Indira Gandhi Sahyog Yojana, which is basically meant for the women which are trying to have the maternity benefit during or in and around the services. So, how these women can also be put to the mainstream. So, for that also the maternity benefit scheme is there, the Indira Gandhi Matrat Sahyog Yojana. And through that we basically try to see that even during the maternity leave also they can have the provision for cash, so that they should not be deprived of the economic benefits which could have happened, because if they are not in a position to have because of the maternity provisions. And then we try to see that there are certain other schemes which are meant for the nutritional and the health status of the women, like we try to speak about the Janani Suraksha Yojana. Now, this Janani Suraksha scheme, which is basically an outcome of the National Maternity Benefit Scheme previously included. Now, this is basically a package which is meant for the new natal mortality, female feticides, the gender disparity. Then we try to see a very familiar scheme which of course is quite popular, that is NRHM, National Rural Health Mission, which is basically covering the various aspects of the health provisions in the rural India, especially for the women working in the rural. The Anganwadi programs are there. So, these provisions are basically meant for having certain amount of upliftment for the women in terms of the health status. Then we also have the protection of the girl child, especially we try to see that there are many technologies which are being used for the prenatal detection of the sex of the child, and for that also there are certain regulations and the preventions which came into effect in 1994. And this is basically meant for to avoid the imbalance in the sex ratio. And as we know that Haryana is a appropriate example, where you have the high rates of the female feticides which took place. So, in order to overcome that, we have to have a strong provisions, so that we can have a healthy child irrespective of whether it is a male or a female. Similarly, we have the specific programs. The Rajiv Gandhi program is there in that sense, the crèche scheme for the children's and the working women's. Now, this is basically a scheme, the national crèche scheme, which is meant for the women's who are having a young boy, baby in that sense. They can also work in the situation, and the provision of the crèche is there. Like we try to see that there are certain provisions which are there in the various employment scheme also, like in MG Narega also there was a provision that if the women wants to work and during that working hours there should be a provision of crèche, so that they can have the proper earning, as well as the care of the child can be taken, due care can be taken by the respective agencies. So, there are the provisions, and these provisions are basically meant for maintaining or retaining the good health as well as the upliftment of the women. Now, another dimension which is equally important, and I think that requires more attention, is the women in relation to the economic empowerment, because we try to see that there are social security measures, there are the health measures in that sense, but the women can be equally become important when they are becoming the earning hands. And for that, I think the economic empowerment is one important aspect which can really lead to the development of the women in a holistic way. Like the prominent scheme which we try to see is the Indra Mahila Yojana. Now, this is basically seen as the first self-help group based on the women's empowerment, and this is basically a scheme which was been launched in 1995-96, which is basically the part of self-help group provision all over India. Then we also have the Rashtriya Mahila Kosh RMK. Now, this is basically a national credit fund which is meant for the women, and in this basically 1993 when it was been implemented, it is basically seen as that the government is acting as an agent for providing the micro loans to the poor women. And these poor women in that sense, basically in the organized sectors, they can come together, they can have their own business or a small units in that sense, where actually they can make some earnings in that sense as such. So, I think the micro loans are been the flexible micro loans in that sense are been provided by the government of India. Now, we also have the Swam Siddha, that is another scheme in that sense, which is basically dealing with the self-help groups in that sense as such, and it is basically having wide provisions including the budgeting in that sense. The good budget in that sense is involved with regard to the women in terms of having certain business in that sense. Then we also have a specific provision called as the STEP, that is the support towards the employment program for the women, and this is again a central sector schemes that came into existence in 1986-87, and its basic impact was to see in terms of women in the traditional sectors, and not only putting them into the traditional sectors, but also providing them with the alternative employment, providing them the specific skills, and through that they can have a better understanding about the society. And the most important thing in that sense of course is the provision of the credit as well as providing them the proper marketing. Now, if these two agencies are there, definitely the women can be more self-reliant rather than depending upon their family or the peer group. So, we have to see that women and economic empowerment requires certain provisions and motivations from the government. And along with that, we also have certain other measures like this Dhanlakshmi scheme. Now, this Dhanlakshmi scheme is basically providing a conditional cash transfer. Now, that is called as CCT. Now, this is basically a provision for financial incentives to the poor families to have certain conditions, and we can have the short term income support, and also we have the time to promote the long term behavioral change. Like if we have some small provisions for the income and how that is going to impact upon their families, and if it is been seen in a positive way, definitely it can be turned into the long term provisions for the upliftment of the women. But there are certain limitations which are associated with these issues. The one important aspect associated with this special financial incentive scheme is that there are too many formalities in that sense. Conditions are being laid which cannot be fulfilled by a layman women. Then apart from that, to have the zero finance account in the post office or the banks is again an important issue. And apart from that, we also try to find out that there is a delay in the transfer of the funds. We also have always the delay in getting the birth certificates from the concerned authorities. We also have the problem associated with the Naxalism, especially in the tough terrains in that sense where there are no proper services which are available. So, one has to really see that even this program which can be launched, but it requires the equal supports from the different sectors, and if it is not there, definitely the program cannot reach to its full viability, as which we see in the different aspect. And along with that, the so called interlinkage between the center and the state, I think that is very important, because the centers have the provision, but the state do not want to implement it. Sometimes it is the state who takes the initiative, but the center does not want to support that scheme. So, I think there is a need for having a mutual relationship between the two, and then only we can have the better empowerment of the women. Now, let us try to see in some other ways, like when we try to speak about the grievance redressal mechanism. Now, the grievance redressal mechanism is basically something which has to be taken due care, but what is happening is that many times the problems are being raised, there are the suggestions, there are the complaints, but what happens to those complaints? What is the outcome in that sense? That is completely missing. So, one has to really see that how these grievance redressals can be taken care in that sense as well. And definitely, as I suggested earlier also, that there are always the delays which are concerned with the authorities to get the things done. So, in that way we have to have the clear cut changeover in terms of the professional mechanism in that sense as such, then only we can speak about these difficulties which can be overcome. Now, we have the economic empowerment, we also have to see it in terms of the social empowerment, because the economic benefits are to be turned towards the economic aspect, especially when we try to see there are certain schemes which are meant for the social empowerment. Some of them, if I rate, the Swadhar is there in that sense. Swadhar is basically launched by the department in 2001 and 2, and it is basically meant for the holistic and the integrated services to the women in the different circumstances. We have the Swashakti projects, again it is a very interesting program which also tries to deal with the confidence enhancement of the women in terms of the control over the income. Similarly, we have the Stri Shakti Puraskar. Now, this is basically a award which is meant for the women, and the important point is that the name of the women are being those women who are the successful cases, including your Jijabai, Devi Ahilya, Lakshmi Bai, Rani Gandilu, and many other women in that sense who have a glorious history, and in the name of these women there are the Stri Shakti Puraskars which have been implemented in 1999. Then we also have the specific schemes which are meant for the Balika Samriddhi Yojana 1997, and the basic idea was to have the status, good status for the girl child, and to bring about a positive change in the family and the community attitudes. So, these are certain schemes which are trying to provide the women in terms of the social spheres. But the important thing is that these social empowerments, the provisions are there, either it is a Swadhar or it is Swashakti projects or the Stri Shakti Puraskar or the Balika Samriddhi Yojana. Now, these programs have to be dealt in a wider way, so that the effective social empowerment programs can take place. Now, if we try to see these programs, we have seen the economic empowerment, now we try to see the social empowerment, and coming down to the third aspect, that is again more important, that is the political empowerment. Now, the political empowerment, definitely we try to restrict to the participation, but I think that is not essential, or it is not the sole base through which we can have the real development. What is more important in that sense, of course, is that the women can have the full right in terms of the decision making, and for that we have the Panchayati Raj which came into existence in 1970s, and later on, of course, there was a provisions for the 73rd and the 74th amendment which came into existence in 1993. Now, these are the provisions, basically it deals with the democratic decentralization, power to the grassroots, but apart from that, giving the power to not only the grassroots, but also to the women and the deprived sections, because in the 73rd and the 74th amendment there is a provision for 1/3 of reservation for the women, the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes, and this provision is basically making the women to be the representative on behalf of the society, and that is really giving an empowerment to the women. And apart from that, we also have, other than political empowerment, there is a need for the certain provisions for the women and the sexual abuses, especially the trafficking, and the government of India in 2000 has signed the UN Convention Act against the transnational organized crime, which is basically meant for suppressing the issues related to the women trafficking. Then we also have the childline services. These childline services are 24 hours in that sense as such. There is a phone call mechanism in that sense as such, and these childline services are basically meant for providing any sort of information which deals with the abuses related to the girl child and the women in that sense. So, there are certain provisions, the political empowerment, where are certain issues related to the sexual abuses, the women trafficking in that sense as such, which again needs the due support and the provisions by the government. Now, apart from that, if we try to see that violence definitely plays a crucial role, and violence is also a symbolic presence of the women, in a sense that if women are empowered, definitely violence can be seen as the representativeness, maybe sort of a what you can say the issue which is sometimes trying to demotivate the women. So, in order to overcome that, we should have certain provisions whereby the women should be put free from the violence, either it is a personal violence or the public violence. Now, within that we have the convention of the elimination of all forms of discrimination against the women, and that was adopted in the government of India in 1993. And apart from that, we also have certain provisions and the measures which are related to the land, environment and sanitation, especially the gender inequalities which persist in the laws and which are basically related to the control over the land holdings. Then we also have the Hindu Succession Act which deals with the right over the land, and with beyond that we also try to see that in relation to the environment there are certain movements which took place. The Chipko movement is the glaring example, where the women stood for the regulations and for checking the cutting of the trees by the traders, and in order to fight against that, women have come together. We also have the women's decade, the popular movement which took place, and in the 1972 Stockholm Environment Conference, these issues have been taken up. So, it is not only that women are simply restricted to their own domain for the development of themselves, rather sometimes they are also serving as the preservatives for the environment. Vandana Shiva has basically talked about the women in terms of the staying alive, where the women's participation and representation to protect and safeguard the issues of environment are being taken up. So, these need some revolutionary legal reforms to bring about a change in the status of the women. Now, we have with relation to the sanitation, because sanitation definitely plays a crucial role for the enhancement of the environment, to enhance the community. And within that we have to see that the women are responsible for water in the house, women are responsible for hygiene at home, women are responsible for the health of the family, especially the children, women are responsible for the sick and the elderly, gender are basically seen in terms of the toilets in that sense as well. Now, in many cases we try to see that the women is at the center, and in these provisions or in these issues, I think women is the center which is acting as an agency to bring about the proper sanitation and the health. So, I think if the women is sensitized enough, I think we can have the lot many measures for precaution and for prevention of certain diseases. And like we have this Swachhata Abhiyan, where the women are been said that going out for the toilet in that sense has to be banned, the public toilets have to be banned, and sometimes we try to find out that these provisions are basically meant for empowering the women, that if the house is not having a toilet, so the women is not going to marry. Now, these are certain mechanisms through which the women can empower themselves, can show some resistance, and through that we can see the transformation and the empowerment of the women. Now, apart from that, in this module, if you try to see, there are certain issues as I discussed earlier, which can act as a key concept. Now, gender is one, development and the women empowerment. Now, to just refer, we can see that what gender is. Now, gender is basically a socially constructed role, behavior, activities and attributes that are related to a particular society and which are considered appropriate to, and it ascribes to a specific men or women. The development, as I said, is basically trying to improve upon the conditions of the life of the people, and the women empowerment we try to see it in terms of having the balancing of power to both the sexes, and it is not the power over the others, or it is basically the power to the one. It is basically that both of them are to be seen as the power holders in a balanced form, and they should not have a conflicting interest with regard to the sharing of the power. So, these are certain things which one should know, and there are certain references which one can read out for further readings, like we have the prominent work by Beena Agarwal, which basically deals with the gender and the legal rights. We also have the work by John Mary, which is basically covering the governing populations and the girl child. We also have the Govind Kilkar's understanding on the fog of entitlement with regard to the women's inheritance, and apart from that there are various reports, as I said, that Vanna Shiva's work, which is basically staying alive, relating to the women and ecology and the survival of the Indian women. Now, these are certain things or certain works which one can have for further readings if somebody is really interested in having the wider horizon of the women empowerment in general. So, thank you.